Good afternoon and good morning to folks. My name is India Hextall and I am a policy analyst with the National Skills Coalition. And thank you for joining the Creating a More Inclusive Economic Recovery and Future of Work in California breakout session today. We hope that you enjoy day one of the Skills for CA Summit, and we have so much more in store for you today. So that we can all get a sense of who is in the virtual room, can you please place your name, organization, and what you hope to get out of this session into the chat for me, please. The format for this session will go as follows. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to give presentations and opening remarks on their work surrounding creating an inclusive economic recovery in California. And I will signal a 2-minute warning for each panelist. After the opening remarks, we will move to facilitate a discussion with audience Q&A. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and please feel free to share any questions, comments, and resources in the chat throughout today's session. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. As the 5th largest economy in the world, California has the opportunity to model what an inclusive economic recovery entails. To achieve that, workers who have been historically underserved and those who have been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic have to meaningfully and thoughtfully be included in any recovery strategy. In this panel discussion, experts and participants will consider and brainstorm pragmatic strategies to ensure that economic recovery strategies center the needs of and benefit the most vulnerable workers, generating a new social compact for work and workers in California. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel. Betty Hung will serve as the moderator for this session. She currently serves as staff director at the UCLA Labor Center, where she oversees programs and operations, including program development and strategy, staff supervision, strategic planning, organizational development, fundraising, and strategies to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. For over 20 years, Betty has been a social justice advocate with significant experience in multiracial, values-based coalition and alliance building. Next, we have Abby Snee, who serves as Deputy Secretary for the Future of Work at the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency. Abby previously served as Chief Executive Officer of Jewish Vocational Services, and she is a member of the California Workforce Development Board, the California State Rehabilitation Council, and a board of the National Skills Coalition. Jeffery Wallace is the President and CEO of LeadersUp. LeadersUp connects young people from disadvantaged backgrounds with job opportunities and training and helps employers reduce turnover in the process. Mr. Wallace fulfills the dual roles of visionary and architect, getting in front of the issues that fuel educational and economic inequities and uniting people around shared goals to achieve disruptive and transformative change. And last but not least, we have Heddy Nam, who serves as Senior Director of Talent Development at UNITELA, a nonprofit leading collaborative education reform efforts to strengthen cradle-to-career education to ensure equitable opportunities for underserved communities. In this role, she leads UNITELA's workforce system change and policy efforts and supports program development. Thank you, Betty, Jeffery, Abby, and Heddy for joining us today. We are all looking forward to the conversation. And now I will turn it over to Abby to kick us off.
Thank you, India, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm so pleased to see so many friends and colleagues as participants. And just to be clear, when I joined the state, I no longer serve as a board member of the State Workforce Board or the State Rehabilitation Council, but work closely with them and continue to be very proud board member of the Skills Coalition, and I'm so grateful for the work that Skills for California is doing here in the state. I would like to just very briefly set the context for the labor agency strategy around an equitable recovery and set that context in terms of the economic impact, the recommendations of the Future of Work Commission, how those created our current strategy and how that strategy is really being implemented, hopefully as a value statement in the May revise and the governor's California comeback plan. So just a few economic points around the context. As I think everyone knows, COVID and the resulting economic crisis really ripped the Band-Aid off of the underlying inequity in this state, and revealed the depth of inequity in employment in California. We saw a disparate impact of COVID and job loss on low-wage workers and very largely workers of color. Our colleagues at the California Policy Lab at UCLA, whose analysis is just simply stellar, have shown that workers relying on unemployment benefits during the crisis have been substantially more vulnerable than in past recessions. Workers in the food service and entertainment industries, who tend to be younger, less educated, and people of color, were the most heavily affected as these industries shut down a year ago in response to public health orders. And we saw that women who have been particularly affected by the unique nature of the crisis, largely for their role as primary caregivers, filed proportionally more claims than men. Now we're seeing that recovery is slow, it is uneven, though it is accelerating. And you may have seen the report out just this morning about the surge in job openings at the end of April. However, as of the end of March, fewer than 2/3 of the jobs that were lost in the pandemic had returned, and that has been slower than the pace of recovery at the federal level. And the industries that had the greatest layoffs are the slowest to recover. And the sectors in which we are seeing the greatest employment growth right now and starting to experience the kinds of worker shortages we've all been reading about tend to be those sectors that are offering lower wage jobs: warehouse, delivery, care, hospitality, and service. So I want that economic picture to be painted. The Future of Work Commission was created by the governor well before the pandemic in May 2019 to shape the future of work in California and create a new social compact. And its analysis of working conditions as part of its research, I think, really were prescient in identifying some of the crisis that we're trying to address now. And really the heart of the challenge facing California's workers and the economy are the lack of mobility, the lack of equity, and the abundance of low-wage, low-quality work. Even before the pandemic, just under 1/3 of California workers made under $15 an hour, and the majority of those workers earning those wages were working full-time. And the majority of workers earning less than $15 an hour are women, and workers of color were and continue to be at least 3 times more likely to live in poverty. Based on this research, the Future of Work Commission came up with 5 leading sets of recommendations, and I would like to direct you all to the Future of Work report for much more full description of the work and the depth of the recommendations. But broadly speaking, these are to ensure jobs for everyone who wants to work, to eliminate working poverty, to create a 21st century safety net, to raise the standard and share of quality jobs, and to future-proof the state with jobs and skills, to future-proof both California's workplaces and its workforce. Based on these recommendations, in response to the economic conditions, the labor agency has been working across departments and divisions on a shared strategy framework leading to an equitable recovery centered on job quality and equity. And these simply are based on 4 core principles: making the bad jobs better, with a focus on care, with a focus on kind of improving, some of the jobs that we're seeing emerge in manufacturing, and then building more and stronger ladders into the good jobs and really doubling down on creating access into those good jobs for people who've historically been left behind. And then undergirding all of that, strengthening the public workforce system. And the governor's may revise budget as part of the California Comeback Plan proposes some significant investments that support this strategy. We have been working closely with our colleagues at the Office of Policy and Research on a $1.1 billion economic resilience and jobs package that has as kind of its umbrella strategy the SERF, the California Economic Resilience Fund, which will support and align regional economic planning for a just transition to a carbon neutral economy, to accommodate other changes in the future of work, and to align workforce development strategy and implementation for that just transition planning. However, we can't and won't wait until those plans are completed. This investment package also calls for dramatic expansion of our high road training partnerships, which really are a proven strategy for industry-based partnerships and earn and learn programs that support Californians to build their skills for good quality jobs, both in today's economy and in anticipating new and emerging job creation. The HRTP sector strategies really call out those industries most affected by the pandemic, hospitality, property services that employ significant numbers of women, immigrants, people of color, to focus on improving the job quality in those sectors and working with employers who are offering higher quality jobs, as well as targeting industries in transition, such as advanced manufacturing, or those critical to the state's other policy efforts, including healthcare, trade, transportation, and logistics, forestry and agriculture, and construction, including residential construction. The budget package really, in efforts around systems change, calls for new and promising and exciting and deep collaborations with the California community colleges, something that we in the workforce system have been advocating for many years, to create new pathways to good jobs and to leverage those community college resources in support of high road training partnerships, in support of apprenticeship and employer-based training, and to create new systems and partnerships for shared outcomes and innovations. And we are excited that will call for funds to support these partnerships driven by sectors identified by the state, most of which I've just described, as well as funds that will respond to proposals from joint planning at the local and regional level made through partnerships through the workforce development boards and the strong workforce partnerships at the community colleges. The package also calls for new and deeper investment for the employment training panel to support training opportunities for new and also incumbent workers, and to address skills gaps in economically disadvantaged regions and build on ETP's COVID response program, which really had a focus in new job creation in small businesses. Overall, these proposed resources will train over 50,000 Californians and really should be the cornerstone of high road recovery from a workforce perspective in support of California's comeback. In addition to this large package, you've probably read that sprinkled throughout the May revised budget are calls for workforce strategies in other departments in the state, and we're very excited about developing partnerships to support those in education, in creating teacher pipelines, in behavioral health, in long-term care and child care. So this really is a vision to seize the moment and prepare our workforce for good quality jobs and improve the jobs that need to be better in this state. Okay. Thanks, India. Bye.
Thank you, Abby. Next, we have Jeffery.
Good morning, everyone. And India, thank you for having me, as well as the Skills Coalition. It's great to be here. My name is Jeffery Wallace, and I'm the founder, president, and CEO of LeadersUp. We're a national talent development accelerator focused on bridging the divide between the untapped potential of young people and an anti-racist economy in America. And I'm going to unpack that for us through this presentation, because as we know, historically, America's economy has always been racist, and quite frankly, was racist by design. So I have a couple slides that I have prepared to walk through. And from there, we can move forward. So I'm going to share my screen, India. Excuse me for being slightly tech deprived.
Do you see the share your screen button at the bottom? It's green.
Yep.
Okay.
One moment. Can you see my screen?
No.
Okay, I'll press it one more time. If not, we'll just go with that.
There we go.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thanks everyone for your patience. And thank you, India, for your assistance. So as we know, America for the last 4.5 decades has built an economy based upon not really valuing labor for their true value. Even today, when we look at the wage and inequality gap, white men are paid at $1 and African-American men are paid at 77 cents on the dollar. And at the height of the societal awakening around the intersection between racial justice, police system reform, or the lack thereof, and with COVID-19, LeadersUp as an organization took a step back and said, well, what is our contribution to ensuring that the next generation of talent lives in and thrives within a better economy than the one that currently exists? And more importantly, to Abby's point, how do we develop an economy that works for everyone, particularly those that have been historically marginalized in this context? So we know there was a cultural climate awakening with George Floyd's murder. Even in the midst of the pandemic, George Floyd's murder and the nationwide protests that followed made race-related issues the top problem facing our country last year. And arguably to this year, with a number of corporate citizens now saying that they're committed to advancing racial justice. The viral video footage led to a record public outrage we haven't seen since the LA race riots. Floyd's murder impacted us all, including many young people across the nation. And in Minneapolis, from his daughter, Gianna Floyd, to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old young lady who captured the video that was being utilized in the actual trial. And for a moment, I want to focus on Christopher Martin, the young man and cashier at Cup Foods, which is where we later seen the crime for George Floyd, that received a $20 bill from George Floyd, alleged counterfeit $20 bill. Christopher Martin is 19 years old now. Unfortunately, he unfortunately feels personally responsible for George Floyd's death. He's an avid soccer fan and desires to become a realtor in California one day. He is also a product of a racist economy and life of disadvantage as the youngest of 5 siblings raised by a single mother. Chris's unfortunate burden was a direct result of working for a company with racist policies. I want to share with you a video so that we can hear from Christopher himself.
Not only am I like the contributing factor, I'm kind of like the big domino that fell. And then now all the small dominoes are just scattered.
Martin doesn't blame himself, but that guilt he felt is still there.
Since I've testified, for the most part, it's been extremely positive and extremely encouraging.
As the world reacted to George Floyd's death, the teen says he thought about Floyd's children.
I know what it's like to grow up in an African-American household without a father. I just hope and pray that George's daughters know that they can do it. And it's possible to do it, to make it, and to be successful, even if your father is no longer with you. Not only am I like the contributing factor, I'm kind of like.
So I wanted to lift up Christopher Martin because he's a representation of the Black, Indigenous, people of color, young people that we serve at LeadersUp. Christopher Martin testified that the store's policy was the employees who accepted counterfeit bills would have to cover the lost revenue from their own paychecks. When we discuss diversity, equity, inclusion, we have to remain grounded in the understanding that we're talking about real people. Young adults like Christopher Martin need more than a just opportunity to work. They need environments intentionally designed to recognize and embrace their diversity by employers who value them. And they need policies, procedures, and management strategies that uplift their humanity rather than detracting from it. And let's be clear, we also understand that that policy could have been remediated just through insurance. But because of not having a force of accountability and a pathway for progress for employers like Cup Foods, these type of policies run rampant and put young people of color in very compromising, in BIPOC town in general, in very compromising situations across the country. So as I said, LeadersUp bridges the divide between the untapped potential young adults of color and anti-racist employers. We are leading talent development accelerator, creating access to equitable career pathways, not just jobs, but pathways for BIPOC young adults. We go beyond placing diverse talent. We aim to connect young adults to anti-racist employers. We define racist as policies, practices that generate racial disparities or different outcomes by race, whether intentional or not. Anti-racist, therefore, then refers to an explicit purpose and intentional goal to eliminate any policies, practices that generate these types of disparities. Here's a look at the organizations that we worked with. We are at a critical juncture in today's society where the public statements of solidarity are no longer cutting it from corporations across the nation, and even our public system around advancing racial equity. People are demanding that employers back their words with action. 2/3 of Americans say that they want companies to speak out publicly against racial injustice. 70% want their employers to create an inclusive workplace. And with over 100 million employees working in the private sector, that's 71% of the market share of the labor market. The private sector is uniquely positioned to be able to advance racial justice and create an anti-racist economy. Lasting systemic change requires collaboration across all sectors. And our mission at LeadersUp is to essentially help these organizations evolve into intentionally anti-racist entities. As an intermediary over the last 7 years, we've really been focused on driving impact through intentional collaboration. In the Bay Area, we worked on the Bay Area Young Men of Color Employment Partnership, with Policy Link, Urban Strategies Council, the Bay Area Council, as a way to forge cross-sector collaboration to generate game-changing career pathways for young men of color, as well as transformative business practices for some of the top Fortune 500 companies in that region. Our Rise Up to Recovery Youth Summit, in partnership with the California Endowment and the Department of Labor for California, really lifted up the voices of young adults, especially in Central California, that are really focused on breaking through the agricultural business and moving into the new economy of California. In the USC Price Center for Social Innovation, we work directly with academic institutions to craft innovative solutions with employers that are policy driven, as well as grounded in practice. So I just want to give you a flavor of the work that we've done in the past. We've impacted 60,000 young people across Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area. 95% of those are diverse. 200 plus companies have been impacted. Our career readiness training has yielded a 3-to-1 interview to hire ratio compared to 18-to-1 standard. And what I'm most proud about is these young adults that were deemed opportunity youth or disconnected youth, not in school and not at work, by putting them back, placing them back in work and on career pathways, they've generated $956 million in tax revenue and the alleviation of tax burden as well through not being connected to social services, which debunks this narrative that young people, especially young people of color, are liabilities. They're assets to our country, and especially to our local economy here in the state of California, given that we're already in a multicultural dominant society. At LeadersUp, we create change from a standpoint of our big goal being an anti-racist economy. We ground our work in insights that we collect directly from both of our audiences of young adults, employers, and our secondary audience of system leaders. We innovate what we call inclusive talent solutions that close disparities across the wealth and income inequality gap that really perpetuates this racist economy in America that focuses on education, employment, compensation, and benefits. We built networks of influence. We have our Involved Employer Network, which is a network of employers focused on driving a more inclusive recovery, because we know when we look at the recovery from The Great Depression, 9/11, and the Great Recession, young people of color in communities in general did not benefit like our white counterparts. So it's important that we focus employers on inclusive recovery, as well as the long-term goal of driving an anti-racist economy. Again, here are the systemic drivers of a racist economy. Education and upskilling. To Abby's point, is important that we just educate and upskill folks in alignment with the future of work and in alignment with what's in demand in a local economy. Employment opportunities, and we call these careers plus. Employment opportunities that are actual pathways that don't leave young people in an entry-level opportunity, but grows them intentionally with continued education in alignment with bolstering the performance of the organization, of the company, as well as continued academic attainment and credential attainment of young adults in alignment with the future of work, setting them up for longer-term success and not just success with one employer. And then in compensation and benefits, that's a big thing. As we look across the landscape, we know that a lot of BIPOC talent caps off at director level and does not move into executive leadership. We also know that benefits change and fringe benefits change once you move into the higher ranks of executive leadership, like being vested, having equity, etc. These are wealth building opportunities that employers can really focus on driving, that more employees have access to those. I'm racing India because I know I'm over time. But I do want to land on this one slide, and this is our impact model at LeadersUp. As an intermediary, it's important for us to ensure that we are actually engaging and generating value for both of our core audiences. And the interesting thing is that in closing the wealth and income inequality gap, it's not a trade-off for any of our audiences. It's actually a win-win-win. A win for the employers, as you see on the left-hand side, that employers, as they address education, they expand their pipeline of ready-to-work talent, a direct objective of our state right now. Employment opportunities that are pathways increases business competitiveness and loyalty. Compensation and benefits also increases retention. On the right-hand side, we'll also see that how diverse talent improves education outcomes for our diverse talent, increases economic opportunity through career pathways, and compensation and benefits, of course, expands opportunities for wealth building. And I think it's important for us as practitioners and leaders in this space to raise our own aspirational capital as it relates to BIPOC talent. We need to move from wages to actually career pathways, to wealth, from jobs to career pathways. And across the space in general, if leaders in the sector would raise the aspirational capital for BIPOC talent, I think we would actually see more outcomes that are transformative. We believe that an anti-racist economy works for everyone. It will increase our GDP by $2.4 trillion. So this is not about taking someone else's slice of the pie in order to increase someone else's. That's an 18% increase in the economy in America just by closing the wealth gap. And over the next year or 2 years, LeadersUp aims to ignite a movement to build an anti-racist economy. COVID-19 and social distancing pushed us all through a digital transformation. And we're going to scale our work to impact 10,000 young adults across each of our markets by the end of 2020. We're designing an opportunity marketplace with the support of other partners that are actually going to drive virtual hiring fairs, virtual training opportunities for both young adults and employers, because employers need a lot of practice change as well. A lot of this conversation is focused on how do we fix the community instead of transforming the corporate citizens driving the economy as well. And we're going to do that through our Evolve Employer Network, which is an inclusive network of employers who have committed to advancing racial justice, now are going to be operationalizing that commitment through transforming their policies, practices, and people management strategies to close those disparities across education, employment, and compensation and benefits. Big picture, India and our broader audience is that we know that an anti-racist economy will benefit all, and we know our journey starts now. We've seen, because of COVID-19, systems do transformative work in a blink of an eye, whether that be the education system, the workforce development system. And I'm so glad to participate in the conversation to talk about how do we not regress, but actually progress towards a more equitable economy for everyone. Thank you for your time. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was awesome. And we look forward to hearing more from you and Abby and Heddy in the next facilitated discussion. But for now, I'll turn it over to Heddy to give her opening remarks. So take it away, Heddy.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted and honored to be in dialogue with all of you and speaking amongst such a distinguished panel. I know that this is such a broad theme that could be used to describe so many of the efforts across the state that many of you are engaged in. So I'm looking forward to making a small contribution to the conversation by adding Unite LA's efforts and perspective. Jeffrey and Abby have already gone over some of my talking points, which gives me the opportunities to skip a few things and get a little bit deeper than I planned. I know one of the reasons that National Skills Coalition invited me was because of the work that Unite LA does as a business intermediary. So I'll be able to expand a little bit on my perspective on working with business to facilitate an inclusive economic recovery. So I'll start with a brief background of Unite LA to provide context on where we're coming from. Many of you know us, but we're a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to cradle to career education reform, founded in the 90s. So for over the last couple decades, we've acted as a trusted education and workforce development intermediary across business, education, and government partners. And for each of our cradle to career segment content areas, we run direct service programs, we conduct policy advocacy, and have systems change projects with our partners. So we often act as a convener of various collaboratives and projects. And the reason that I share that is because we believe that having a finger in each of those functional areas allows us to get better at each of our areas by wrestling with the challenges that are inherent to policymaking, as well as working to serve employers, students, and workers on the ground. Many of you know us as being linked to the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. We, for 16 years, from 2003 to 2019, we served as the Education and Workforce Development Department. But since 2020, we became independent, once again, to continue our work with a greater focus on economic equity, kind of right-size our relationship with our business partners a little bit and serve a broader range of business and employer stakeholders. So last year, when we went independent, of course, the pandemic drastically impacted our world. And as we were doing the rapid response work that many of you were engaged in, we gave a lot of thought to the opportunity that this crisis brought to have a renewed focus on advancing equity. Like Abby and Jeffrey mentioned in their remarks, this is just a time of newfound consciousness about racism and all of the inequities resulting from the policies and practices, decisions that we've made over the last few decades and hundreds of years. So like many of you, we believe that, this is really a time to make courageous, bold changes rather than doing business as usual to address the underlying structural systemic inequities that are faced by our communities of color, women, immigrants, and others. So we developed what I put in the chat is our 12 principles for a new economy that acts as a high-level values-based guide for our work, and especially with our conversations with policymakers around rebuilding in a more inclusive and equitable way. So I won't go over all of them here, but some of the highlights definitely relate to this conversation around dismantling systemic inequities and deconstructing not only public but private sector policies and practices that replicate and reinforce systemic inequities due to race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, etc., crafting solutions in partnership with the most impacted communities. I really loved, Jeffrey, your talk of just lifting up the voices of the actual communities that are experiencing the problems on the ground and encouraging policymakers to design equitable policies and practices in partnership with those communities. So we would like to also add supporting a cradle to career approach that looks at people and communities holistically across generations and family and time, instead of just as a set of labor as folks mature and begin nearing the age of or are in the labor market. So really looking at 2-generation or intergenerational approaches to reduce poverty and advance economic inclusion, develop and fund alternatives to incarceration, develop humane immigration policies. So that was just a selection from some of the principles that we've been crafting specific policy asks around as opportunities arise. Thankfully, the Biden and Newsom administration and many legislative leaders have already exhibited leadership of our shared principles, and Abby went over a lot of the investments in equitable workforce development and quality jobs in her talk. So I will skip over all that. And despite the good news, of course, we're here because there's so much work left to be done. Reflecting on prior economic crises over the last few decades and the resulting economic recoveries, we all know that even though economic growth came back, each one massively increased economic inequities along race, gender, immigration status, and other lines, creating challenges not just in employment, but in general, in economic and social life for students, workers, and their families. An example of this is the recovery in the tech sector after the tech crash in 2000. The tech industry in Silicon Valley had no problem roaring back, but built a then future of work that is currently not very equitable and inclusive. Examples of things that happened was they heavily fought for H-1B visas to import certain types of immigrant labor while not making the decision to invest in the local community and the talent pool that could have been trained and developed with a workforce strategy to be part of that industry, nor did workers in other sectors that were supporting the tech industry from domestic work, food services, logistics, they were not benefiting from the growing economy and in fact were hurt by it. So we all know that like it's great news that we all have this newfound redoubled focus on equity, but we know that it's been very hard earned. And we need some intentional strategies. So I'll share a couple of strategic priorities that have been collectively elevated in the LA region by regional workforce development system leaders in many collaborative conversations over the last year. And so the two interlinked, like inextricably linked strategic priorities. One is the one topic of this session, which is the future workforce. So how do we gear workforce developments to be geared towards industries that's going to fuel the betterment of our community, create economic growth and our good jobs, and doing this not just as a standalone as public workforce development systems, but doing it in partnership with business, workers, labor, community organizations to understand not only the skill needs, but also how to design good quality jobs. Getting a 2-minute warning. So yeah, this recognizes we need to understand industry and partner with them. The good news is DEI has become a familiar mainstream business topic, and many employers are recognizing the value of hiring from diverse communities. Where we still need to do work is bettering our strategies and tactics for actually creating access to the job opportunities that exist for the communities that have the most barriers. And then looking beyond hiring, something that Jeffrey touched on in his comments is the employee experience after hiring. What is their experience? How long are they at the job? Are there upskilling, advancement, and promotion pathways? Because many DEI efforts prior to the pandemic focused on racial and gender diversity of senior leadership and board positions without thinking about the vast numbers of workers of color, women, and immigrant workers that are working low-wage frontline entry-level jobs that could be developed into middle-skilled jobs through public sector partnerships with things like OJT funds, et cetera. And we still need to just understand a lot more about employee turnover, retention, upscaling, all of that. And of course, cultivating and strengthening our relationships with existing business leaders who are committed is important, but it's so important to advocate for policy in California that continues to raise the floor of the labor market, because individual employers are just not able to tackle large social and economic issues at a firm level. And as you all know from being leaders in your own organizations, culture change takes time and resources, and our workers can't always wait for individual, like a firm by firm level change. And then lastly, I'll just say that despite all of the great work being done, people still aren't getting equitable access to the existing opportunities, because a lot of the publicly funded workforce programs, there's a lot of challenges by frontline staff with the do more with less mandates, or there's duplicative data entry, and there's just a lot of ways that our systems are not geared to, designed with the needs of the people that they serve in mind. So we need a lot more, like in K-12 education systems, there's a lot more scrutiny by advocates around outcomes that it's achieving. And I think we need to do a little more of that and be in the lab about what our communities truly need. So still a lot of work to be done, but I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation and working with you all long-term to facilitate an inclusive and more equitable recovery this time around and make the courageous changes we all pretty much know we need to make. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heddy, Abby, and Jeffrey, for your opening remarks. And next, I'll pass it to Betty to go ahead and get us started with the discussion. And folks, the attendees, please feel free to add any questions or comments in the chat, and I'll be sure to lift those up to Betty throughout the session. Take it away, Betty.
Thanks so much, India. And I so appreciate India and the National Skills Coalition and Edge Coalition for creating this space, an opportunity to have this conversation. So Abby, Jeffrey, and Heddy, thank you for your insights and really lifting up that, in this moment, as we really grapple with this question of an equitable and inclusive recovery, that we cannot return to normal, right? That rather that this pandemic really exposed and exacerbated the existing inequalities and the disproportionate impact on people of color, immigrants, women, young people, and so many who have been historically disenfranchised. So I want to start with a few specific follow-up questions for Abby, Jeffrey, and Heddy, and then we'll ask a couple of questions of all of you, and then go to some of the questions from participants. So Abby, I want to start with you. You talked about, really seizing the moment with the California Comeback Plan. And, in reflecting on your unique background, right? You spent decades in the trenches, really at the forefront of workforce development, and now are serving in government, right? In public service, and have a unique vantage point of also seeing how government works and how that intersects and impacts folks on the ground. So in this moment, or in order to seize the moment, as you mentioned, what are your thoughts on how community partners can best engage in strategic partnership with the labor agency to really ensure that there is an equitable and inclusive recovery? What are your thoughts?
Thank you so much for the question, Betty, and you're really tapping something that is so near and dear to my heart. And I really believe that the most powerful work that we can do comes at the intersection of policy and practice, and that the voice of community-based organizations is just so critical for grounding policy in the lives of real people, and that community stakeholders bring an urgency that's important for public leaders to hear, as well as real life examples and stories. I actually spend a fair amount of time pushing colleagues, myself, on getting dollars out once they've been approved quickly, fairly, and efficiently. I think when you work in direct service and you've looked in the faces of people who don't know where their next rent payment is going to come from, you know that we have to really work with an urgency to get the dollars out to change lives. And state leadership, and I'd add local leadership, because so much of our work system is locally driven. So focusing at the local level is critically important. Really need the voices of community stakeholders and need to hear directly from the people who will be most affected by their decisions. I think state and local leaders need very concrete recommendations for programs and initiatives and ways of making partnerships and programs more effective. We need a feedback loop on what's working, what can be improved. I loved what you said, Heddy, about advocacy around performance and tracking more of those metrics, as well as letting us know and state leaders know emerging practices, your testing, and just so honored to be here with your vision, Jeffrey, for what you have seen and proven is possible, and what you and LA Compact are doing, Heddy. But we just need to know what you're testing, what you're thinking about emerging best practices, as well as what you're learning from colleagues in other states. I think we can be a little insular here in California, and there's some really great work going on in other parts of the country that may surprise all of us. And I would say, as another couple of suggestions, focus on solutions rather than problems, although setting the context of systemic problems is always helpful in framing those recommendations. And I would say focus on recommendations that target actions that whichever partner you're working with can actually move forward on. And I think that includes really being well versed and clear on what are local decisions, what are state level decisions, and where federal action is needed, and advocated at all three levels.
Thank you so much, Abby, for lifting that up and that intersection of policy and practice, and the importance of really folks on the ground who are impacted, really offering some of those solutions, right, and affecting policy and decision making. So thank you so much for that and lifting that up. So Jeffrey, I want to turn to you, and you spoke very powerfully about the urgency, right, the imperative to build an anti-racist economy, given the underpinnings of our racist economic system, and some of the strategies that LeadersUp is using. So, and you touched on this a bit, but I'm wondering if, first, if you can dive a little bit deeper into talking about, in this moment, right, as we think about the recovery, and that we can't return to the new to normal, but instead, how do we really transform and use this moment to transform the system to be more anti-racist? What are your thoughts in going a little bit deeper about policies, strategies to support young people of color to thrive post-COVID, and including what anti-racist employers can do?
Absolutely, and thank you, Heddy. It's been amazing to watch the public system do backflips to reimagine itself and be able to stay afloat during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, which means that rapid transformation across large-scale systems are possible if they're pushed. And I think it's important, number one, that we do not allow these systems to regress. We've been fighting for a blended learning opportunity and context across K through 12 and post-secondary for decades now. Now we have that in place. Let's double click on that opportunity, ensure that we look at it through a lens of equity, digital equity. We're going to move towards, a blended learning environment, which we should, because we're more living in a more tech-enabled and globally connected society. Then we need to ensure that folks have access to not just broadband, but the hardware necessary to be successful. We double click on that, even from a standpoint of digital access to employment opportunities. A lot of employers have moved to a full digital talent acquisition strategy. But if you don't have access to Wi-Fi, and if like many of our young people that 8 out of 10 say that their primary computing device is their cellular device, then that actually excludes them from participating in the labor market, because majority of these websites for talent acquisition are not compatible with computing from a mobile device. So understanding the context, and to Abby's point, looking at not the challenges, but the data to infer strategies that can inform policy, et cetera. I think there's opportunity also for us through our post-secondary system to really reimagine career and technical education, and ensuring that is in alignment with what's in demand now and in the future. A good example of a partner that we're working with is Google.org. Google.org has taken their career certificate in programs, because for years, let's just be frank, Google and the tech sector have been recruiting talent from some of the top universities, which excludes communities like the one I'm from, Richmond, California, which is a stone's throw away from the Silicon Valley. But when I was growing up in the early 2000s, we had little to no access to the type of training necessary for me to be able to compete in the Silicon Valley. Now Google is taking the training that they would utilize to onboard staff from those top universities, and now flipping it outside into career certifications in some of the 13 of the most in-demand career pathways across the tech sector. Not just serving their own talent needs, but serving the tech needs of their sector and beyond. It's a very innovative way of reimagining career and technical education in alignment with what's in demand of the economy, and in alignment with what employers need across. I think it's also important that we challenge employers to take care of their front yards. We're working with the Los Angeles World Airport right now. Now, surrounding Los Angeles World Airport, similar to most airports across the nation, is an underserved, low socioeconomic community, South LA. South LA, by not fully employing that community, LA City and County is missing out on $500 million of tax revenue by not ensuring everyone in that community is employed that wants to work. So we're challenging LAWA, Los Angeles World Airport, as one of our employers, to take their diversity, equity, inclusion commitment beyond, to Heddy's point, the top brass of their company, and really look at how do you build public-private partnerships that skill up folks in alignment with your needs. We have a lot of the travel, hospitality, leisure industry that's on the incline, and they do not have the teams necessary to be successful. So getting in front of that, we partnered with community colleges locally to align career and career certifications with the demands of LAWA and its large supply chain, as well as companies that work as partners to Los Angeles World Airport in across that space. So I think it's important for us to really take this moment in time as we focus on BIPOC talent and young people to understand the context that we're in and create new solutions. And it's going to take a public-private partnership, because there's things that can be available through state funding, federal funding, and there are other opportunities that require more innovation, that require more research and development, that require resources from the private industry. A lot of the private institutional givers, a lot of corporations have the means, but just have not put those means to use. We saw that in a recent report from New York Times, that there were billions of dollars committed to advancing racial justice from the private sector, but less than $250 million have actually been committed and hit the ground running. So I do think that we have to engage these corporations, especially the large Fortune 500 corporations in the state of California. You have to hold them accountable to the actual resources that they have, but also give them a path forward, as well as practices they can implement that will help move the needle for BIPOC talent and for their bottom line simultaneously.
Thank you so much for sharing your powerful insights on that, Jeffrey, and for really lifting up that we have to push systems, right, and push corporations to ensure that there are actual concrete outcomes that impact real human beings and the human impact of that, so that we can really move the needle on an anti-racist economy. So thank you so much for that. Heddy, I want to turn to you next. So you talked about the need for to focus on equity and outcomes, right? And the importance as well of policy to lift the floor for in terms of working conditions and employers. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about Unite LA's vision for creating a diverse and inclusive workforce in California, and how are you engaging your cross-sector partners in advocating for these types of policies, and what's been the response of policymakers?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I think I laid out a little bit in my opening talk what our vision is, but to sum it up very crudely, it's that employers are getting the talent that they need to run their business, but the worker is also getting a job that's good quality, and they have equitable opportunity to compete and succeed in that job. And so some of the work that we're doing on the ground regionally with employers, for example, we focus on two high growth sectors in LA, and one of them is the tech sector. And we're really doing a concerted effort to not make Silicon Beach go the way of Silicon Valley. So really asking tech employers to put their money where their mouth is, not just have a nice like DEI statement on their website, but take on providing work-based learning opportunities, including paid work experiences, and bringing folks in from justice-involved youth, foster and transition age youth who were recently disconnected from school and work, like folks that they may not have thought of or being too difficult for them to figure out like an on-ramp to their company, and introducing them to in a systemic way to public sector institutions like community colleges and adult ed schools, because so many employers rely on relationships with four-year institutions, particularly elite four-year institutions, to fill positions that don't really require a four-year degree, and then really facilitating as an intermediary those partnerships with the true talent scouts on the ground, whether they be the faculty and counselors at the education institutions, but also community-based organizations, including WIOA contractors. But there's many organizations who do workforce development outside the WIOA system. And through doing a lot of that work, I think employers see the true value of developing a local diverse talent pool by the things that those folks are adding to their company and their industries. And so they've been a little bit more eager to either engage in and commit to equitable policy advocacy, or at least be open and not have a knee-jerk reaction as a business of like, oh my God, California is proposing something else that's going to make it difficult for me as a business. So just having some of those conversations. And then in our systems change work, we convene the LA Workforce Systems Collaborative, which is a collection of leaders of regional workforce development systems, because we know, and they asked Unite LA for support as a neutral convener, because we all recognize like big systems are just not that great at communicating with each other because they have their own set of bureaucracies. So even the best of intentions, it's difficult. And so this collaborative was started back in 2005, and in the last recession under Obama's era, they did a lot of collaborative work and increased outcomes for community coordinating around use of state and federal funds. So they're continuing to do a lot of that work. And we're actually very heartened by many business organizations like the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce and others actually approaching Unite LA and say, hey, we would like to be part of the voices, chorus of voices advocating for equitable workforce policies, but we just don't know the specifics. Can you onboard us onto like what's happening in the landscape and where should we add our political capital? So for much of Unite LA's work, a lot of the work was around just educating employers to the value of investing in community and equity. But I think, you know, given all of the efforts across the country around racial equity organizing, we're in a different time. It's very exciting. So we're really looking forward to actually working on implementation and getting kind of our hands dirty instead of just trying to convince people that this is the way to go.
Thank you so much, Heddy, for talking about those strategic initiatives and the way that you're really engaging in systems change and in some ways, I think really culture change too, right? And changing hearts and minds as well. So thank you so much for that. So I have, the next question is for all three of you. As we talk about an inclusive and equitable recovery, there's also been discussion about the 2008 Great Recession, right? Which again, disproportionately impacted people of color. For example, African Americans who were hard hit were also had the longest period in terms of recovery, right? And so we know that the recovery from the 2008 Great Recession was also inequitable. And so as we think about those lessons from 2008, what are some key takeaways, do's as well as don'ts, that you think we should be mindful of and intentional here, especially given that, again, as all of you have discussed again today, it's people of color, immigrants, women who again are disproportionately impacted. So how do we ensure that, unlike 2008, that there actually is a truly equitable recovery now? And I would invite any of you to start us off.
I'm happy to start. I think there are two lessons that we can take from the last recovery. One, and I think we've all talked about it today, is to flip workforce development on its side, and not start on the supply side and hope that the jobs come. President Obama, then Vice President Biden referred to as train and pray, but to really flip towards starting with the jobs and starting with the good jobs. And certainly our investment and high road training partnerships do just that. And we now have, well over 5 years of demonstrated success that when you really put together these industry partnerships with workers at the table, when you're focusing on targeting those skills to employers' needs, then, as both Jeffery and Heddy spoke so eloquently, everybody benefits and we have a stronger economy. The other lesson is that we waited way too long in the last recession to catch long-term unemployment. And long-term unemployment is a curse. In the last recession, there were millions of people who never re-entered the labor market. And we know that the longer people are out of work, they lose confidence, their skills erode, their networks fade, and the longer they're out of work, the harder it is to get back in. And in the last recession, that really hit so hard for older workers who just never were able to get back in. And working in San Francisco at the time, when the tech sector was growing, saw such rampant age discrimination then. What the labor agency and EDD are doing is working in partnership with the California Policy Lab to really understand the dynamics that point to those workers who will be most vulnerable to long-term unemployment and to try to catch them early. And as is no surprise, the current data is showing that workers of color, workers with less education, are going to be more vulnerable to long-term unemployment, and that technical definition is being out of work for 26 weeks or more. And so our Workforce Services Branch at EDD, the Labor Agency, are working with the California Policy Lab to develop strategies to start identifying people who are currently on UI and reach out to them early. Should have been doing this for a while, but to reach out to them before their benefits expire, before they hit the go over the cliff of long-term unemployment, to really re-engage them in the workforce sooner and faster.
Yeah, I think that from a state of California perspective, that it's important that we understand where our economy goes, the nation's economy goes as well. It's one of the largest economies in the world. And it's important for us to then, really take into account, which I didn't think happened with ARA in 2008. We just can't put new wine in the old wineskins. The things that have been working in the past have not worked at scale. They have not. If they had worked at scale, we wouldn't have the largest population of individuals living at or below the poverty line in the state of California, with some of the largest companies in the state of California at the same time. I think that we need to take a look at this blended education and workforce development model. Is big in Los Angeles, but when we look at outcomes related to those models, it's focused on education, GED, and not in alignment with acquiring certificates and skills that actually help people move from a mobility standpoint. We also need to be really holding the public sector accountable as an employer. California should be in a state of emergency based upon the dire need for talent that we have. And that's from EDD through public health. I mean, right now we should be reinforcing and quote unquote future-proofing the public healthcare system and department. We should be future-proofing the employment, the EDD department. And we should be utilizing a lot of the resources that will be coming down to build back and invest in an infrastructure to ensure that these public sector civil service roles that are widely underfilled and experiencing a tremendous, what I call silver tsunami of aging workforce retiring, and slower now because of the economic downturn, but still retiring, is leaving us tremendously at risk from not having the talent necessary to keep our state running. And then the last thing I'd say, especially given some of the investments that are coming down the pipe as it relates to infrastructure, is that we put an iron clamp around public labor agreements to ensure that companies that are receiving tremendous amount of resources from the federal government are actually held accountable and given the support from the local system to actually build the type of talent necessary to fulfill those public labor agreements as well. So as we're focusing on infrastructure, let's also focus on smart growth and responsible growth. As we're focusing in on system transformation, let's ensure that those systems are transformed to lead, to actually generate the type of outcomes necessary to move our economy forward. And Abby hit the nail on the head. That is skilled talent in alignment with the future of our economy. And I just think that we have to scale what works instead of doing what's easy and scaling and funding those that have been funded in the past.
Yeah, I want to pick up and highlight, underline, bold Jeffrey's point. When I think of a do is like the workforce systems and community-based organizations really did work together coming out of the last recession. And some of it was necessity. You had to do more with less. We're in a slightly different environment right now because we have a lot of resources coming down the pike, but it's more important than ever to coordinate to truly deliver user and community-centered services. Jeffrey's point about making, holding ourselves accountable for outcomes to really say what we accomplish what we say we want to do with these policies and funding. I really think it has to do with us going back to the lab. Part of our equity approach should be, we should all be humble and think once again about user-centered design. We're in a different the place in society right now. Like digital inclusion was not as important as the last recession. I wish we started because we'd be in a better place, but right now it's like that is a non-negotiable. And so I think this is a time where we need a lot of innovations and then figure out a way to scale innovations fast. And then I completely agree with what Abby said of don't wait too long. Political capital like this doesn't last forever. Like in the last recession, the anger at the banks and Wall Street did not last 5 years. It was about a year and you could pass a window of policy and then people kind of went back to business as usual. We all know in this room the big courageous changes we need to make, and we should not be waiting 2-3 years to do it. We should do it now.
Wow. Thank you all so much. I mean, I think your insights are so powerful, and given the urgency as you all articulated, right? The urgency of this moment and the importance of really focusing on outcomes. and accountability across the board that we have to, that unless we do that, there really can not be true equity, right? Several of you talked about the importance of innovation and scaling up. So I'm wondering if you can highlight what are some policies or programs or emerging practices that you would say are especially innovative and effective right now, and that from your perspective should be scaled up as we consider, right, and try to strive towards an equitable recovery. And if you can maybe provide your insights, also keeping in mind, especially those who are shut out of the system, right, and who face barriers to even accessing the public workforce system. So what are those innovative, effective policies or programs that you think we should all know about and that ideally would be supported and scaled up?
I'll start, Betty. And I mentioned this earlier, our partnership with Google.org and how we're really developing demand-driven career technical education. The reason why I lift this up as a promising practice that should be scaled to impact talent is that we should get every sector to develop demand-driven employer-informed training that is endorsed by employers and across the sector, so that we can also dismantle the industrial and educational complex that is based upon your social economic status. You have the ability to pay for an education, you have more social capital to gain a job. To Abby's point, let's flip that model on its head. Let's ensure that we're developing a state of learners that are committed to understanding the more of the right things that you learn, the more that you will earn. And being able to have higher transparency between credentialing and compensation, so that workers and talent know, as I acquire more education, I have the ability and the access and opportunity to gain more wealth because these companies are aligned with it. One of the major things that I think is critical about this approach to demand-driven career technical education is that not just designing the certificates, to Abby's point, in training and praying that folks actually get jobs, but Google.org also built a consortium of employers that have all signed on to hiring from now this new pool of talent, which really just debunks this myth that pedigree equals high performing from an education perspective. It's more competency that actually drives high performance for the individual and for the company as well. So I just want to lift that up as a promising practice because it, one, helps us stay in alignment with regional economic needs from a talent perspective. Two, it allows more access points to folks that don't have the means financially to further their education or might be blocked out from financial resources like the Pell Grant and other things based upon criminal history and background, et cetera. So we want to ensure that we're designing equitable, demand-driven strategies that are centered around access points for workers.
Yeah, I can build on Jeffrey's insights and usual prescient comments. I think one thing we want to do is redefine what we mean by public workforce system and redefine it in a way that shares the onus and the responsibility with employers, you know, as well as our educational partners, as we've already talked about. I mean, in my mind, the most promising practice is the gold standard of apprenticeship, right? And for, I think, the communities that we care about, the communities that have been most affected and left out by the current crisis and left out historically, can't afford to take years out to study. And we also know, which pedagogically, that the most effective learning goes on in a hands-on earn and learn, work-based learning model. So, you know, we're really excited to work towards achieving the governor's very ambitious goal of 500,000 apprentices by 2029, and very grateful for our partners at the Irvine Foundation for supporting some assistance through New America Foundation to really build out an apprenticeship strategy that will have 5 components. You know, you already talked about construction and the anticipated expansion with infrastructure spending, both at the state and at the federal level, and pushing for project labor agreements. The governor's budget, you probably saw, also calls for $20 million for residential apprenticeships, and we want to build on the success of the high road construction careers and, frankly, create better jobs within residential construction and do that through PLAs. We also have so many opportunities to expand apprenticeship in what are thought of as non-traditional areas. You talked about technology just over and over again, and new practices in apprenticeship in tech companies, in cybersecurity, really help meet the needs of the industry and build a more diverse, more productive workforce. We're having really interesting conversations with pipeline development and teaching in building out apprenticeships in teaching. And it is so important for the future of our state and our society for children to look at teaching as a viable career, particularly children of color, and start building that pipeline earlier. Jeffrey mentioned the challenges in employment in the public sector and the state sector. And there are some, I won't call them barriers, but there certainly are hurdles to expanding apprenticeship in the public sector. That could be an area of where advocacy partners could be helpful. But, we need some new levers to open up apprenticeship in state service and other public sector. Those are good jobs. There is an aging workforce, as Jeffrey mentioned, that really lend themselves to earn and learn. And we have so many opportunities and are really starting to dig in a different way with our partners in the K-12 system to take youth apprenticeship to scale, really across the state. And also opportunities to just create more apprenticeship intermediaries by sector and by region. So I would say just so many ways of expanding, earn and learn, and opportunities for partnerships. Right.
One thing I'd like to add to the conversation as a promising practice is for the workforce development systems to also partner with employers around advancement, retention and advancement and upskilling strategies. I know that, for example, one of our partners, South Bay WIB in LA, they said they leverage OJT dollars a lot more because just out of necessity during the pandemic, because there certain employers did not want to let go of staff. Like they had the best intention to be a good employer, but unfortunately some of the employees they had on staff simply did not meet the skill needs to be able to work from home, et cetera. And that's when they were able to step in and leverage OJT dollars to fill in, like Jeffrey said, those targeted competencies without having to take off full-time work to earn a credential to get to a middle skill job. So I know that there's a lot of conversations going on around job quality, and those are very important, but for the massive numbers of Californians who are in low wage positions that are disconnected to upward mobility career pathways, I think there's a lot of promising practices like Kaiser working in partnership with SEIU to leverage the union partnership and presence to recruit from non-clinical positions such as food services, janitorial, to do a lot of that selection and recruitment to help identify candidates for positions that were critical needs that employers were having gaps around, such as surgical technicians, et cetera. So I think there's a lot more there if we truly want to promote economic growth for each individual family. There's some opportunity there to look into some of those practices and scaling those out.
Thank you all so much. I mean, it's so exciting to hear about these, innovative programs and practices and strategies that we can and should be replicating and scaling up in this moment to take advantage of this political moment, as Heddy had mentioned. So I want to turn to a question in the chat. Thank you to Victor Burgos for asking this. So the question is, how can we network with you all? And AMBE, we're national award-winning bilingual educators. We do drive change for an equitable trained workforce. And so let us help your organization with advanced manufacturing skills and DOL apprenticeships. So I'm wondering if you can, if you all can, if any of you would like to share your thoughts on how there might be opportunities to partner, especially given the importance of bilingual, multilingual education and skills.
But I think it's important for us to build partnerships at the level with multicultural organizations, because many of BIPOC talent are linguistically isolated, just from the system, from a standpoint of having access to information, the training that is being provided in a language and dialect that fosters broader educational outcomes, as well as just the advocacy necessary on the from a workers' rights perspective on the work side. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, especially in California, which is a multicultural dominant economy and society already, for us to really be leaning in to ensuring that through translation, through developing partnerships that with trusted sources in the community that can that allow these opportunities to penetrate communities so that there's broader access to opportunity. I sit on the Equity at Work Council for the Rework the Bay Funders Collaborative, hosted by San Francisco Foundation. And one of the things that we're actually grappling with now is that we do a lot of movement building across the Bay Area region, but there's so many, in a good way actually, different languages and dialects that we have to take into account based on the diversity of that region. So it's important that we lock arms with organizations that are trusted and have the capabilities to help us penetrate communities so that these partnerships and opportunities are on the high on their awareness. A lot of the communities that we work with are like homes without windows. They can't see past the barriers towards opportunity. And I think by building public-private partnerships and strategic partnerships like with yours, Victor, it allows us to carve out windows in communities so that they can see the opportunities that exist in the region as well.
And Victor, I just sent you my email and would love to learn more about your work. Manufacturing is a sector we're taking a deeper look at, and would love to learn more about what you've done and are doing and would like to do.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So I know we have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if each of you would like to share some final remarks, and then after that, we'll turn it back to India. So maybe we can start with you, Abby, and we'll go in the same order. Abby, Jeffrey, and then Heddy.
Sure. I mean, what I've really gotten from this conversation, and so grateful, Betty and India and Jeffrey and Heddy, to be part of this conversation, and have learned so much from listening to you, Jeffrey and Heddy, is that it truly does take a village. And it takes a village to get people back to work, to get people into good jobs, to create a stronger, more equitable economy, and to define that economy in new ways. One of the recommendations and I think guiding lights of the future of work vision is to create metrics around job quality that are really used to measure our progress as a state. And those should be adopted nationwide. But I think it really does take partners in the public sector, in the private nonprofit sector, our institutional funding partners, employers, and the people who really are the core of our work, our community members, to work together to just make this a better place and a more equitable place.
Thank you for the fantastic facilitation, Betty, and India and my fellow panelists for sharing. I've learned a lot too, Abby, and a couple things that I just want us to leave us with. One, we just have to face the reality that the culture of racism in America is more pervasive than the culture for good and anti-racism. So it's going to take courage. It's going to take courage of speaking truth to power, whether that is, a top tier Fortune 500 company that want to push jobs and pour jobs into our community. We have to say we have to challenge corporations and the individuals leading those corporations to ask, would you put your own child in this work? And if not, why can't we create better conditions? Then we also need to understand how the culture of racism has impacted our sector of organized labor. When we look at the unions, you see a sharp dichotomy between people of color and their white counterparts as it relates to the laborers and the technicians. We have to ensure that we are courageous enough to speak to powerful unions about true equity in this moment in time to diversify from a standpoint of generational diversity and racial diversity and gender diversity as relates to supporting workers and talent, more importantly, on the work site. And then last but not least, I think it's important for us to lift up the value of intermediaries that can accelerate outcomes on both the talent side of the equation, as well as the business practice change of the equation. Because again, I think that if we were working before we got to this point, we wouldn't need to take this Herculean lift and really transforming systems. So I think we have to do what Jim Collins says in his book, Good to Great. First, we got to face the brutal facts. Then we got to ensure that we're going in the right direction with the right concept and ensure that we have the right people in the right seat on the bus. And I think that's the big thing for system leaders, funders, to really think about is beyond impact, we want to be transformative moving forward. And in that transformative nature, we have to unroot some of the ugly truths around how we operate in order to tackle them from an innovation perspective. So again, I thank you guys for your time.
Yeah, I share Abby and Jeffrey's gratitude for this conversation, and I completely agree with both of them that it'd be really nice to have a vision that we are working towards that is very concrete metrics, because I think some of the metrics that we have, they're useful, but I don't think we often have the conversation in our day-to-day work that they're really the floor and not the ceiling for what we're shooting for. And so those metrics don't necessarily advance us in terms of economic equity and inclusion. They're useful performance metrics to have. So yeah, I've just gotten so much out of this conversation, and I'm looking at all of this Zoom squares, and I know many of you, and I know that you're doing such impactful work. And my thought as I'm leaving is I would love to talk to India and Melissa and the National Skills Coalition staff about how we keep some of these conversations going. We are working in different places as different types of intermediaries or with different performance measures and all of that in different regions of the state. So we're almost like touching different parts of the elephant, and just I found this incredibly energizing, and I learned a lot. And as I look and read the newspaper every day or go on social media, I don't think this type of conversation is as sharply out there as some of the other talking points about concerns about business recovery and all of that. So how do we leverage our political capital to be a little bit more in the forefront of the California conversation? So that's my thought as we leave.
That is such a powerful way to conclude. I mean, thank you so much. I also am grateful and learned so much from each of you. And I know that there's so many in this space right now who are doing such powerful work. And so that question of how to stay connected and continue to work together is so important. So I'm going to pass it to India. And thank you, India, for all your leadership in really making this conversation happen.
Yeah, thank you again to Jeffrey, Abby, Betty, and Heddy for leading this conversation. And it was very fulfilling. I was taking notes and I learned so much from you guys today. So next we will have about a 10-minute break. And we ask that you come back to the platform at 12:40 to join us for our featured speaker, who is Assembly Member Ash Kalra, who is Chair of the Assembly Committee on Labor and Employment. So we hope to see you guys in a few minutes, and have a good one, y'all.